Back during medieval times, the doctor's first question wasn't what disease you had. It was which of your 4 bodily fluids was out of balance. And for over 1,000 years, that was considered science. It might sound like a joke. From ancient Greece, through the medieval period, and well into the early modern era, the dominant theory of medicine in both Europe and the Islamic world ran on 4 fluids. Nonetheless, if you were healthy, all 4 were in balance. If you were sick, one of those fluids had gotten out of control. The treatment was to restore the balance, whether through diet, through daily habit, or through rest. One of the most persistent and widespread medical practice of the entire era was through bloodletting. This meant opening a vein and draining fluid out of the body, because the theory said there was too much of something in there. Back during these times, there was more of a university-educated, physician-approved standard of care across the known world. After the Greek physician Galen said it, the Persian physician Avicenna had refined it. However, for 600 years after Avicenna, virtually nobody questioned it seriously enough to change it. And then came a man with one of the longest names in the history of science, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who decided that essentially all of it was wrong. The name you might know him by is Paracelsus. What he did to medicine in the 16th century sent ripples so far and so wide that they eventually reached the Ottoman Empire, further changing the way their civilization thought about healing and treating sick persons. To conceptualize why Paracelsus was so radical, you should take into account he was revolting against how embedded that system was. The theory of the 4 humors traces back to Hippocrates in ancient Greece and was systematized by Galen, a Greek physician who lived from 129 to around 216 CE. Galen was brilliant and extraordinarily influential. In fact, so influential that his medical theories survived the entire medieval period and continued to dominate medical education well into the 1800s. Galen attached a temperament to each humor. Blood produced a sanguine character who was optimistic and energetic. Black bile produced melancholy, making you prone to sadness. Yellow bile produced a choleric nature, making you prone to anger. Finally, phlegm produced the phlegmatic, affecting how slow you act. When you call someone phlegmatic today, or describe someone as sanguine or melancholic, you're using vocabulary that comes from a medical theory from over 2,000 years ago. The Persian polymath Avicenna, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Sina, would take Galenic medicine and build on it, producing a comprehensive medical system that became the foundation of healthcare in the Islamic world from the 11th century onward. His canon of medicine was one of the most widely used medical textbooks in both Europe and the Middle East for hundreds of years. In Istanbul and in Paris, physicians operated under the same assumptions and largely prescribed the same treatments. Medicine in the early modern period wasn't far from what we're familiar with, because the medical culture of Europe and the Ottoman Empire was more similar than different. Paracelsus was born in 1493 in what is now Switzerland. He rejected the traditional authorities of medicine with a drive that was either brave or reckless, depending on how you look at it. He believed that even engagement with folk traditions educated a physician far more than reading Hippocrates or Galen. His argument wasn't just stylistic, probably, because it was substantive. Galen had developed theories in a world where syphilis didn't exist yet, being a disease that arrived in Europe from the Americas in the 1490s and spread with devastating speed. Galen's framework had no way to combat it. Paracelsus thought the entire humoral theory was wrong at its core. He originally argued how diseases weren't imbalances of fluids. Rather, they were specific conditions with causes that required certain treatments. Neither of those treatments had to come from plants and herbs. They could also come from minerals, really from any of the procedures that alchemists had been developing for centuries. The combination of alchemy and medicine that Paracelsus systematized was called iatrochemistry. For every disease, there was a cure that could be identified and prepared through chemical processes. His term for this was arcanum, which was a secret remedy that covered each disease. His approach to preparing these remedies was called spagyric art, a term he first used in his lectures at Basel. It described the different methods of working with organic and inorganic matter, transforming substances through heat into forms the body could use. This was new, even opening the door to a pharmacological study of minerals and metals. Paracelsus was also extraordinarily difficult to deal with personally, willing to publicly burn the works of Galen and Avicenna in a gesture that made his position unmistakably clear. He was fired from his position in Basel as a result, so after a legal dispute, he spent the rest of his life traveling and arguing. Sadly, he died in 1541 without seeing his ideas accepted by the medical establishment. That acceptance came slowly over the following century, as his followers did the work of reconciling Paracelsian with the remnants of Galenic medicine. Two figures in that reunion are particularly important for the Ottoman part of this story. One of them was Oswaldus Crollius, who lived from around 1560 to 1608, the other being Daniel Sennert, who lived from 1572 to 1637. Both were Paracelsists working to integrate chemical medicine into mainstream medical practice. The goal was to achieve a form that European universities could accept. The question of how Paracelsus's ideas reached the Ottoman Empire is itself fascinating. Medicine in the Ottoman Empire was universal in a way that many people don't expect. Even non-Muslim communities had access to Ottoman medical education and professional guilds, which was unusual for the era. Greek physicians operated throughout the empire. On the other hand, the Italian, English, and French doctors joined diplomats in Ottoman cities. This constant movement of people meant a constant movement of ideas. The most likely pathway for Paracelsian medicine into Istanbul was through these networks. Jewish physicians in particular, some of whom were engaged in practical Kabbalah and had already incorporated wine and spirits into their medical practice, overlapping Paracelsus's existing chemical approaches. The medical establishment was split between two worlds. On one side were the hospital physicians and the professors in the Medaris, who operated within the scholastic tradition. On the other were the marketplace healers, the apothecaries and drug prescribers who worked outside the formal institutions and directly with patients. It was this second group that new medicine found its first real foothold with. And the reason tells you something important about the Ottoman Empire as a whole. Public health in the Ottoman Empire in the mid-17th century was deteriorating. Growing populations and expanding territories created the conditions for disease to spread faster than medical systems could manage. Trade routes that brought goods into Istanbul also brought illness. The plague was a recurring catastrophe, and the formal medical establishment was not offering effective solutions to people who were sick and needed treatment. Ottomans were pragmatically interested in medicine that worked, not in the theoretical elegance of humoral balance, but in actual drug treatments that produced patients' results in a reasonable time frame. Iatrochemistry, with its emphasis on specific drug treatments for specific diseases, aligned with exactly that need. It promised something that Galenism couldn't: targeted intervention rather than managed waiting. The man who brought it formally into Ottoman medical discourse was Salih ibn Nasr ibn Salam, a physician born and trained in Aleppo, Syria. His major work was the culmination of perfection in the treatment of the human body. This drew directly on the writings of Crollius and Sennert, describing new diseases and the chemical and alchemical cures they required. Drug therapy based on mineral acids, inorganic salts, and alchemical procedures. Ibn Salam's reputation was substantial enough that he became the chief physician of Sultan Mehmed IV, following the success of an earlier work, explaining the plague through both heavenly and earthly causes. That combination of spiritual and empirical together is characteristic of how Ottoman medicine approached the new ideas. That's the key word for understanding what happened with Paracelsian medicine in the Ottoman Empire. Medical establishment wasn't to throw out Galenic tradition like Paracelsus would have wanted. It absorbed the parts that were useful, particularly the drug-based approach to treatment, and filtered them through an existing framework that was syncretic by nature. Ottoman medicine had always been willing to draw from multiple traditions simultaneously. Incorporating chemical medicine alongside established Greco-Persian approaches was consistent with how it had always operated. The spread of to be seeded through the marketplace, not official institutions, had consequences that nobody fully anticipated. Because chemical medicine required specific knowledge of dosage, achieving the right amount of a mineral acid or mercury compound created serious problems. Weight units differed across different regions of the vast Ottoman Empire, with a recipe that worked in one city which could be lethal in another. However, because the scales weren't the same, the concept of a lethal overdose wasn't something that the new wave of marketplace apothecaries always handled with sufficient care. Predictably, where there were a promising new system and insufficient regulation, opportunists appeared. People people with no medical training began selling themselves as Paracelsian apothecaries, capitalizing on the promise of quick chemical cures. The reputation of Tib-i-Seated suffered as these fraudulent practitioners grew in number, creating what had started as a genuine medical innovation until it associated with quackery and harm. The Ottoman government eventually even had to step in. Starting in 1703, a series of edicts were issued from Edirne attempting to regulate medical practice and hold practitioners accountable. Physicians who were proven to have harmed patients were banished. Not a single soul was safe. European doctors practicing the new medicine without adequate oversight were expelled from the empire entirely. The regulation was an acknowledgement that something real and significant had entered the medical system, significant enough to require formal governance. By 1729, the approach had shifted again because a new edict declared that physicians needed to combine knowledge of medicine with remedies, neither of which was pure Galenism nor pure Paracelsianism. In hindsight, a synthesis is exactly what the history of Ottoman medicine had always produced when it encountered new ideas. The longer view of what Paracelsus's medicine accomplished in the Ottoman Empire is actually one of the more interesting footnotes in the history of science. What it did, above all, was shift the fundamental philosophy of what medicine was for. Galenic medicine was preventive, since its goal was to maintain balance before disease took hold. Paracelsian medicine was interventionist. Its goal was to identify a type of disease and attack it directly using treatment. The Ottoman medical marketplace's enthusiasm for that interventionist approach, including treating symptoms fast by producing results that patients could feel. The Greek innovations up until the Ottoman ones pushed medicine in a direction that has continued in the same trajectory ever since. The treatment of symptoms, rather than underlying causes, using specific drugs for specific diseases. These are all characteristics of modern Western medicine that trace a line, although the one was one untraceable, back through Paracelsus and his followers, through the Ottoman marketplace apothecaries, through the debates in the Istanbul Medrese in the 1650s, all the way to a Swiss physician burning the books of Galen in Basel. He wasn't entirely right. In all honesty, he wasn't entirely wrong either. The mere fact that his ideas traveled from 16th century Europe to the Ottoman Empire, helping reshape a different civilization, while thinking about healing, is a reminder that the history of science doesn't respect borders any more than disease does.